Hi everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, I'd like to develop some of the concepts that I introduced in the last lecture in the particular context of intellectual goods. And I'll begin with a quotation from Thomas Jefferson, the real Thomas Jefferson this time, who was in fact a very smart man. President John Kennedy in the early 1960s once convened a dinner for all of the living American winners of the Nobel Prize. And there were dozens of them convened in a dining room in the White House. And in addressing them, President Kennedy said that there had not been such concentrated brain power in this room since Thomas Jefferson had dined there alone. In 1815, long after he was retired from the presidency of the United States, Jefferson wrote a letter in which he described ideas in a way that anticipates almost completely the theory of intellectual goods that I'll develop in this lecture. If nature has made any one thing, Jefferson wrote, less susceptible than all others of exclusive property, it is an idea. No one possesses the less because every other possess the whole of it. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me. In those short sentences, Jefferson captures almost all of the essential aspects of what I'll call intellectual goods. Intellectual goods, which I'll abbreviate in these slides as IG, are ideas that are encoded in a specific medium. So intellectual goods are not the same thing as ideas, which cannot become intellectual property. Before intellectual goods can exist, ideas must be reduced to some specific form that allows them to be communicated to other people. An idea must be turned into specific language. An idea must be turned into specific notes or sounds in music. Or an idea must be turned into a specific image or picture in visual art. So, to illustrate the difference, here's an idea. Boy meets girl, families disapprove, and trouble follows. But here are two different intellectual goods which reduce that idea to two very, very different encodings in language. One of them is, of course, the great play Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, and the other is a retelling of the same story by Leonard Bernstein in West Side Story, a Broadway musical of the 1950s. And so, ideas become intellectual goods when they are expressed in particular words, or reduced to particular melodic and rhythmic combinations, or when they are captured on a canvas or in a sculpture. Intellectual goods, so defined, are autonomous goods. That is to say, they're not exactly private goods that can be easily traded in markets, nor are they public goods of the traditional sort, even though they share some characteristics of both private and public goods. More precisely, intellectual goods, the characteristics of intellectual goods, whether they are public or private, depends on the existing state of free riders breaching technology. That is, the existing state of the technique that free riders have to breach the channel, or that sellers have to close that channel to free riders, determines whether intellectual goods are private or whether they are public. Where the breaching technology is primitive, that is to say where free riders don't have the easy and cheap ability to break into the channel of exchange and seize the value of the good being traded there, intellectual goods are impure and they can be traded as private goods. But where the breaching technology is more advanced, and free riders have the technical means to cheaply and easily breach the channel of exchange and seize the value of goods that are traveling in that channel, intellectual goods become more pure, more like public goods, and markets in these intellectual goods can't exist. The intellectual goods can't be sold profitably because free riders can't be excluded. In the case of intellectual goods, the competition of technologies exists between sellers who are trying to keep intellectual goods impure and thus tradable as private goods, and free riders who are trying to purify the intellectual goods and thus make it available to them without having to come to terms with the seller. Let me develop some of these terms and explain them more fully by discussing pure and impure intellectual goods. Let's start with pure intellectual goods. Assume, unrealistically of course, that people are blessed with complete telepathic powers so that they can easily and instantaneously read one another's minds, and that they're blessed with perfect memory, which means that once an idea has entered into their mind, it never goes away again. Notice these two people. They could be communicating telepathically. Perhaps they have perfect memory. And perhaps in this sort of situation, it's not such a good thing for people to have telepathic powers. But if people do have telepathic powers and perfect memory, then intellectual goods cannot be traded as private goods in exchange for several reasons. First, just as in the case of public goods, intellectual good creators cannot exclude non-buyers or limit the distribution of their good. The definition of an ordinary public good is a good such that people who pay for it and people who don't pay for it alike may consume the good. Non-buyers can't be excluded from consuming the good, and so in fact the seller can't sell the good to anybody, since it's possible to consume it with possible to consume it without buying it. A lighthouse is an example of a public good, more precisely the light that comes from the lighthouse. Once the lighthouse is on, it provides light to every boat in the harbor, whether those boats have sacrificed or contributed to the production and maintenance of the lighthouse or whether they haven't. If the lighthouse shines for one boat, it shines for all boats, and no boat can be excluded from using the light once it's there simply because they haven't paid for it. That's the definition of a public good. And if intellectual goods can be transmitted perfectly by telepathy at no cost, then in fact, once I have an idea, I can't stop anybody else from simply reading my mind and taking that idea from my mind without paying me for whatever effort it took to produce the idea in the first place. And because I can't exclude non-buyers, then in fact I can't sell the pure intellectual good. But that's not all. Unlike public goods, like the lighthouse, consumers of intellectual goods can become secondary producers of the intellectual good, and just as in the case of Jefferson's candles, they can transmit the intellectual good from one person to another independently of the original producer. Notice that the lighthouse, an ordinary public good, can't do this. Once the lighthouse is shining, it shines for all. But once the lighthouse stops shining, nobody has any light. The only entity that can produce the light is the lighthouse. And therefore, when the lighthouse stops operating, despite the publicness of its good when it is operating, everybody is deprived of the light, and none of the boats has the ability to produce a substitute for the light on their own. But that's not the case with intellectual goods. Once I have your intellectual good, I can transmit it to somebody else through my perfect telepathy. I don't need you anymore once I've taken the idea from your brain. I can publish the idea. Indeed, an infinite number of people, in principle, given the telepathic powers that we all have, can now enjoy the idea simply by reading my mind and never coming into contact with you, the creator of the idea in the first place. Finally, unlike public goods, the value of all units of the intellectual good beyond the first unit is zero. What this means is that because of perfect memory, once I know something that's important for me to perform a particular task, I never have to learn that thing again. I never have to acquire that piece of information or knowledge a second time, because once I've acquired it the first time or acquired the first unit of that intellectual good, I have no need for any other. On the production side, this has a very important consequence. Suppose there are 3 inputs that are required to produce a new machine. And the 3 inputs, let's say, are labor, raw materials, and the design of the machine itself. Once I produce the first machine, however, the design is manifest in the machine, and the only inputs I need to produce the second copy and the third and the fourth and the fifth copy of the machines are simply the labor and the raw materials. Once I purchase the first unit of the design, that unit, because of perfect memory, suffices to be an input for all subsequent units of the machine that I produce. But in the real world of imperfect memory and no telepathy, intellectual goods are not pure, they're impure, and they can only be sold as private goods under particular conditions. Again, now, people can't store their ideas indefinitely in time. They lose them because they don't have perfect memory. And because there's no telepathy, ideas must somehow be transmitted from one person to another through physical space, typically in some sort of a package. So, given the real world of imperfect memory and telepathy, impure intellectual goods can be sold as private goods if they can be embedded in a package, or what I will call a host, that enables the intellectual good to be transmitted across space, and thus account for the absence of telepathy, and transmitted across time, accounting for imperfect memory, to other people. So if my intellectual good is embedded in a book, I can send the book to somebody else across space, and then they can extract the intellectual good from the book. Or I can put the book in a library, and years later, another reader can extract my idea from the book in the library, even though I'm not there. For some kinds of intellectual goods, the kind we call inventions, the host, that is, the package in which the intellectual good is contained, is the article of commerce itself, as in this ancient early 1950s television. Looks sort of like the first television my mother and father bought in 1952. In the television, the intellectual good represented by the design of the television is in fact manifest in the television itself. What this means is that if you know what you're doing, that is, if you're an electrical engineer, you could buy one copy of this television and you could take it apart. And by taking it apart, you could figure out how it worked, and thus you could extract the design of the machine simply by closely inspecting the machine itself. This is what's called reverse engineering, and patents are designed to protect inventions, more precisely to protect the intellectual goods which are contained in the articles of commerce that manifest the invention. Patents protect sellers of these intellectual goods from the reverse engineering of free riders. It's not always possible, of course, to reverse engineer, as the makers of Coca-Cola have been taking advantage of for decades. Coca-Cola, a popular soft drink, is made from a recipe that is legendarily secret and very, very difficult to reverse engineer. Competing cola companies have been trying for decades to buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, decompose it to find out what its elements are so that they can infer what the recipe for making Coca-Cola is, but they've never been able to do so. And so despite the fact that the recipe for Coca-Cola is protected by law, it doesn't need to be protected by law because Coca-Cola enjoys what might be called a natural copyright on the recipe. That is to say, even though people have been trying to reverse engineer Coca-Cola for decades, they've been unable to do so, and so their product is protected, even without the help of the law. For other kinds of intellectual goods, those that we call works of art, the host and the intellectual good are distinct from one another. So, for example, when we speak or sing or play a musical instrument, the sounds are, or the words are transmitted through the air through sound waves. Alternatively, as I alluded to just before, if I take an idea and I commit it to language, I can insert the idea into the host represented by a book, and with the book I can transmit the idea in the host through time and through space to other people. Similarly, like the painting of Picasso by Juan Gris that is in the slide, an idea, a visual idea, can be reduced to canvas or stone and thus transmitted to other people or preserved over time. Records or MP3s or CDs perform the function of hosting music, and electromagnetic or radio waves perform the hosting function for sounds and images that can be transmitted across the universe as radio or television signals. But it's important to note that it is always the intellectual good embedded in the host that is the article of commerce. And this conceptual distinction is a crucial one because it's the seller's attempt to lock the intellectual good into the host and the free rider's attempt to unlock the intellectual good and use it without paying the seller for the good that is the site of the competition of technologies in markets for intellectual goods. If goods are to be sold at all, if intellectual goods are to be sold at all, the seller must succeed in embedding them in a host that the free rider cannot cheaply and easily unlock and use for his own benefit without purchasing the seller's host and thus compensating the seller.